Hello and welcome to another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. My name is Nassim Ahmed and I will be host for today's conversation. The ICJ passed its ruling recently and we want to have a special conversation about the ruling, its implications, and where we go now with the Palestinian issue. And joining us for that conversation is Kathryn Ravey. Kathryn is a legal researcher and advocacy outreach coordinator at Law for Palestine. She is a former human rights legal researcher at Al-Haq, Palestinian human rights organization. Kathryn holds a master's degree in human rights law from UCL and a BA in sociology, anthropology from St. Olaf College. Previously, she worked in litigating civil rights violation and supporting advocacy for immigrant survivors at the Tahriri Justice Center, supporting NGOs in India and Northern Ireland. So first of all, Kathryn, thank you for joining us and giving us your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
There will be a slight delay, I think, because you're in New York, I'm in the US, and it takes a few seconds for you to fully hear my questions. So we want to start off with the ICJ decision before we get into some of the other questions I wanted to ask you. So let's begin with that. And I want to get your thoughts on the ICJ and Palestine for Justice, the organization itself. What are your thoughts on that, on the decision that was issued last week?
So the ICJ decision is a big win for global order based on international law. The court reinforced the Genocide Convention, which embodies the pledge to prevent the crime of genocide and hold Israel accountable to any and all risks and commissions of genocide. The court concluded that it is plausible that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinian people and issued legally binding orders to prevent all measures of Israel conducting forms of genocide. Crucial to their decision was also their highlighting of genocidal statements, in statements of genocidal intent that were made by Israeli officials, which has previously gone unnoticed in a lot of Western media. So they really positioned the narrative well and where it should be, in my opinion. And this is also a pretty significant moment when we can put this in the context of 75 years of Nakba implemented by Israel and the Palestinian people. And it's a really crucial moment of accountability, which breaks a dangerous culture of impunity that Israel has enjoyed.
And there's been a lot of comment on that. This is the beginning of the end of Israeli impunity. And many people, I think I heard Raz Siegel, the eminent Israeli professor, make that point today. Of course, we'll have to wait and see how far we can take this. And from a lot of experts and analysts that I spoke to, this is the beginning of a long journey in holding Israel to account. And that seems to be the message that's coming across. But one of the things a lot of people are bit frustrated about is the fact that it didn't call for a ceasefire. The ICJ decision itself did not call for a ceasefire. For some people, I think, who have been following this, I don't think they expected a decision at the ICJ to call for a ceasefire. What do you make of that? Why, how surprised are you by the fact that it didn't call for a ceasefire? And, given also the fact that I don't think even if it called for a ceasefire, I cannot imagine Israel ever abiding by a demand for a ceasefire. That's another question altogether. Yes. But, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, although the court did not use the words ceasefire, its rulings certainly implied a ceasefire. I mean, none of the ordered measures can be effectively implemented without Israel halting its military actions. And, the UN Secretary General Guterres has said multiple times, even very recently, that humanitarian aid cannot be delivered effectively without the cessation of bombardment and Israel's violence that's ongoing in the region. So in order to enact the orders of the court, a ceasefire is pretty much implied. And to your point, I think the court is certainly, most courts of the world, especially one of the ICJ standings, is a bit hesitant to make any sort of statements that would not be easily enforced or increase political will, therefore exposing its weakness. So I think this was actually a very smart route to take in essentially requiring a ceasefire, a lack of violence, or at the very least, a de-escalation of violence in order to comply with the court's orders.
And what would you say are your main takeaway points? I mean, one thing I liked is the way they framed the whole discussion, that they provided evidence of genocidal intent by quoting Israeli president. They quoted Yoav Gallant as well, senior Israeli members of the cabinet and officials, and basically arguing in a very powerful way that Israel has a case to answer for. There is a good chance that there is genocide. So the way they made that argument was very compelling for me. I mean, what other key takeaways are there for you from the judgment itself? I know it was only, I think, half an hour it lasted, 20 minutes or so, but what was your key takeaway points?
Well, I think it was very crucial that, once again, the court acknowledged the plausibility of the action of genocide occurring, both highlighting the intent and the action, which are crucial for claiming genocide and proving genocide. But it also, proved and concluded that there is jurisdiction pursuant to the Genocide Convention, that there was urgency, that Palestinians are a protected group, and that Gaza, represented a significant portion of that group. So they clarified a lot of important things that will be useful to this genocide case as we move forward later in the year. They also made some pretty serious implication for third states and third parties in this matter. By declaring this a plausible genocide case, it definitely put third states on alert that that any sort of support to Israel would now be even more overtly aiding and abetting and being complicit in Israel's potential genocide. So I think, that's a really crucial thing that the court noted. And again, I think the language and the narrative placing of this case was really important. They did not highlight any sort of self-defense statements that Israel had made. They really didn't highlight any of the procedural elements that the Israel's case highlighted, and instead focused on statements made by UN agencies and the atrocities that are happening on the ground, which I thought was very important.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that really stood out for me as well. If you look at one of the case Israel already insists, well, one of the propaganda lines Israel uses is that there is no such thing as the Palestinian people or Palestine. And this judgment, of course, that in itself is an anti-Palestinian racist comment to make. But here you have the highest legal body saying that Palestinians are a national body who have a right to exist, and that confirms more than anything else that whenever Israel use that propaganda line, we should point it out and say, you're being racist, your language is genocidal language. And I think that was very powerful. And on the third state actors, of course, that refers to US and the UK and many other allies who are aiding and abetting and supporting Israel in this. But I also wanted to get your thoughts on how do you think the media will react now that this judgment has been passed? Because we've seen over the past 3 months, pro-Israeli newspapers taking, yes, there have been ups and downs, but generally they've been reluctant to call out what we all see in front of our eyes. I'm, of course, talking about New York Times. There was a period it was doing some good journalism during the last 3 months, but over the last few weeks, it's published some really horrible articles like the death toll in Gaza has gone down. That was the headline of one of the news pieces it published. So what kind of impact do you think it will have on the coverage of the war by mainstream newspapers and, of course, other third parties as well?
That's an excellent question. I think how media outlets respond will largely need to reflect what their states and institutions are saying. I mean, I think at least for US media, the Biden administration, although has done a lot of lip service to asking for Israel to, escalate its humanitarian accessibility and to essentially, you know, have greater care for civilian life, but we've not seen that in actuality. And the US as well as the UK have been major suppliers in munitions, arms, financial support that is directly affecting Palestinians in Gaza. So I think media outlets have been hesitant to be critical of that, considering how much the Biden administration is well, this is maybe a separate point, but there's a lot on the line for U.S. elections coming up this year. So I think there's, in my personal opinion, I think there's a lot of hesitancy to overly criticize the Biden administration, even though I think it's been pretty abysmal in preventing this genocide and has certainly done everything it can to support it and has been complicit in it. But that is beside the point. I think, I hope that the media outlets with this ruling are given greater clout and I suppose value in some courage to report on what other media outlets have been reporting, and to also keep their eyes on how Israel will now respond and have to enact these changes. And if we don't see a lot, if we see inaction from Israel, I hope that the media outlets will reflect that more critically. But I suppose it depends on the actions of states as well. I do think, one thing that is important one thing at a minimum, I think that all states should really be doing is conducting, comprehensive and transparent evaluations of whether their arms exports may be contributing to Israel's commission of international crimes, especially genocide. After these rulings, there's sort of a formal, serious risk that genocide is happening unequivocally. And if states don't openly call for that or ensure that they're not aiding and abetting it, they could see themselves complicit in that as well.
Mm. As a legal body, I want to just quickly change direction a bit. We've spoken about the ICJ. I wanted to get your thoughts, the comments around the work you're doing in defending Palestinians generally, law for Palestine. So how will this judgment impact upon your work? And also, what kind of reports have you been producing in the build up to this case? I know, I think I read a report recently where from Law for Palestine, a compilation of many genocidal statements, genocidal patterns of behavior that was demonstrated by the Israeli military. And it's really comprehensive document that was produced. So what kind of work are you thinking of engaging in on the basis of this judgment that has been issued?
Well, thank you for acknowledging the database. It's a very big project, and yeah, it's a database of over 500 incitements to genocide made by Israeli officials, former officials, military agents, and one thing that we've sort of had our hands in a lot of different pots in this regard, a lot of international advocacy, working with state parties to create advocacy campaigns and communications to state their stances on Israel and implement policy measures to ensure that they are not being complicit and are not financially aiding this. We've also been compiling a very large and comprehensive legal analysis that will be submitted to the ICC, basically outlining the case for genocide. So this database that we created was mostly to show intent, because as you may know, in order to prove genocide, intent is always the tricky part. In previous cases of genocide, that's always where states tend to fail. So it's important to show that not only has Israel had clear and blatant intent on committing genocide, but it matches their actions as well. And so that's been a big effort in compiling that and delay, rolling that out for submission, as well as conducting, advocacy campaigns and collaborating with lawyers really from across the world, even those of the South African team, in giving them the information that they need, staying up to date on numbers, on new incitements to genocide. It's a big case, and it's a lot to stay on top of. And I think most of this is going to fall on advocates, everyday citizens, to ensure that their governments and that their states are being held accountable for their action in this. I mean, it's not enough to just look at Israel's actions and blame them. It's, a lot of states have been silent on this up until recently. I think South Africa was the first step forward in a long line of countries, lining up to use international legal mechanisms to hold Israel accountable. And I think it's up to us all to hold them to that.
Are you guys also involved with the legal attempt to bring a case against President Joe Biden in the US? Is that something you're working on as well? Are you part of a team?
So not directly, but we have our partners and collaborators are certainly a part of that, and we have a lot of we've certainly been in touch with that legal team as well. Thankfully, a lot of the same information kind of is drawn on by multiple parties across the world. They are more U.S. centered, so that happens, I think, today actually, or I suppose, what is the date? January 26th, last week, whenever this airs. But I'll certainly be watching that as well.
You mentioned the ICC. That, of course, is a different legal institution. Do you think, on the basis of the ICJ judgment against Israel, the ICC will be under pressure to now pursue Israel because there's a case that's pending, it's ongoing? There's fears that Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor, is procrastinating. He's not really interested in pursuing this case. So do you think this will help the Palestinian cause in the ICC and bring more pressure on the ICC as a result of the legal judgment in the ICJ?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this also, presents the urgency of the matter and certainly puts pressure on the ICC to enact its mandate. I know that the prosecutor has not taken has basically hardly made any visits to the Palestinian territories, let alone Gaza, to investigate this. And there has been a lot of feet dragging on this. Israel has yet to be held accountable in the international courts. I mean, of course, this ruling is a good sign that maybe that will change, but there's been a culture of impunity, and the ICC has certainly been a part of that when it comes to Israel. So I certainly hope that this, motivates and puts pressure on the ICC to enact its investigation and to take its own action. And I think a few things come out of this as well. There's a great hypocrisy with these global powers as they take certain states to the ICC and other international courts. I think of Russia and Ukraine. I mean, the ICC basically wasted no time in issuing an arrest warrant for Putin to be arrested, and something that we have not seen of equal urgency or importance in this case, which I think has caused a great amount of frustration among international lawyers and politicians. And it certainly inflames the urgency of the ICJ to continue its rulings on the side of erring for genocide. The other thing I will also say is, we will see how Israel responds, but assuming they don't enact these measures, which I think is somewhat likely, I'm hoping that South Africa, and they certainly have the ability to bring these court orders to the UN Security Council and to really push this. I mean, it's a pretty huge thing to have an ICJ ruling under your belt when advocating for greater political action from the international community. And I think the same can be applied, assuming that happened. Even more pressure we put on the ICC to see action happen.
And that, I think, if there is a disappointment. That's one of the things that I'm disappointed about, in addition to the fact that they didn't call for a ceasefire, although I didn't expect that, to be honest with you. It is saying Israel should do all it can to prevent a genocide. What does that mean in terms of practical acts on the ground? So maybe that's just the way, that's court speak. That's how they conduct their proceedings, and behind the scene there are probably list of actions Israel will have to undertake to prevent a genocide. I mean, what did you make of that? I mean, is that just court speak, or because just left it to Israel? And as you said, there is no way Israel will probably say, yes, we've been doing that anyway. We've been doing all we can to stop a genocide from taking place. So I thought maybe put some more flesh into that statement and insist on Israel doing A, B, C, D, E. That would have been, I think, a more forceful statement.
I think when it comes to international law, especially human rights, it is more beneficial to remain quite broad and vague, because it allows you a greater range from which to be critical and ask of a state more. I think when you get too specific and narrow, you know, a country can fulfill that one thing, or perhaps, you know, find some workaround and, you know, be a bit narrow in its definition of ceasing genocidal acts. By keeping it broad, it's actually a lot more beneficial to the court and to the international community, because a lot of things fall under its purview. But I will also note the provisional measures were brought forward by South Africa, including the actual asks. So although the court did grant them, the wording of it actually came from South Africa. So this isn't, you know, this isn't something that the court blindly mandated. This is a, you know, a confirmation of an order brought by South Africa. And again, you know, I think when we talk about all acts that contribute to genocide, that could include ceasing violence and, you know, bringing, you know, stopping the displacement of Palestinians, creating, you know, Gaza to a state where it could welcome back Palestinians who've been forcibly displaced. You know, there's a lot of sub-actions that can come with that. If keeping it a bit of a wider definition, though I know it is a bit frustrating sitting here now thinking about what could happen.
Yeah. Lastly, I have to admit, I was one of the more cynical ones. I didn't think decision would go in the way it did. It's quite a positive decision. Very, you know, a lot of things to be optimistic and hopeful about. Were you one of those? Did you? Because I did not expect the judges to vote in such a overwhelming fashion at 15-2, 16-1. That's overwhelming. There was not even a debate, and that in itself, I think, preserves some hope inside me and many others that, you know, yes, there is hope in the international legal system, despite its many flaws, despite the fact that most of us are cynical of these institutions. So which camp were you in, and has that preserved some hope in your case as well?
Well, on a personal note, I think losing hope is a privileged stance to have, because many people in this world aren't privileged to say it's hopeless. And so I do think preserving hope, especially in the world of international human rights law and international law in general, is really important and crucial. So I always remain hopeful. I have to have faith in these institutions. That being said, I think we've witnessed enormous hypocrisy. You know, the UN Security Council vote that resulted in a veto, thanks to the US, the US using its veto power, was a huge blow to that hope, and showed how easily a lot of these mechanisms can be stifled and held back. And I think the ICJ easily could have fallen in that category. And I think I was reserving a lot of judgment, because this is this ruling will be very political. This is going to cause a lot of powerful countries to reveal that they have been complicit in genocide and have not lived up to their human rights statements. And I think there's been a clear disregard for human rights by these states. And in the hands of Western countries, human rights are no longer protections for the individual, but powers used by states to justify violence against others. So for the fact that the ICJ stood up to all of that today and did vote the way it did was a huge win, and certainly shows that there is integrity still in our international legal systems, and that it is worth pursuing, though it may not be effective or fast or efficient, but nonetheless important.
Yeah, I think in the future, this moment will be looked back upon as the point where the tide turned and where we saw the beginning of the campaign or movement to hold Israel accountable and to end the impunity that it enjoys. So I think when we look back in 20, 30 years' time, I think people will look back at this moment. This is the beginning. Thank you. So that was Kathryn. Thank you for joining us, and thank you at home for tuning in. And we hope to see you for another conversation with the Middle East Monitor. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.